I'm the Education Program Manager here at CPW. We are thrilled to have you here for this week's Meet the Artists event with Keisha Scarville and Tina Campt. This series is made possible by a generous grant from the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation, so thank you. We started this series in October 2022 and have hosted over 150 artists so far, almost every single Thursday evening. And it has been my dream to have both Keisha and Tina here in some capacity. I didn't know it would be this. And so I couldn't be happier that they are here today to discuss Keisha's current exhibition installed here at CPW, Recess. So if you haven't seen that already, please take a moment after the talk is over to have a look at that gallery behind us. Before I turn it over to Tina and Keisha, I'll share a bit about their backgrounds. Tina M. Campt is Roger S. Berlin 52 Professor of Humanities in the Department of Art and Archeology at the Lewis Center for the Arts at Princeton University. She's a Black feminist theorist of visual culture and contemporary art and lead convener of the Practicing Refusal Collective and the Sojourner Project, as well as a founding scholar of Black European studies. Campt has published 5 books, including A Black Gaze, Listening to Images, one of my favorites, Image Matters, Archive Photography and the African Diaspora in Europe, and Other Germans, Black Germans and the Politics of Race, Gender, and Memory in the Third Reich. She received the 2020 Photography Catalogue of the Year award from Paris Photo and Aperture Foundation for her co-edited collection, Imagining Everyday Life, Engagements with Vernacular Photography, with Marianne Hirsch, Jill Hochberg, and our very own Brian Wallis. And the 2024 Photographic Studies Award from the Royal Anthropological Institute for distinguished contributions to the study of anthropology and photography. And Keisha Scarville explores diaspora, loss, and the unfixing of identity and body in her work. Born in Brooklyn, New York to Guyanese immigrant parents, Scarville identifies with an innate sense of in-betweenness, a feeling of displacement that weaves throughout her projects. In her series, Mama's Clothes, begun in 2015, clothing and patterned textiles belonging to Scarville's late mother both conjure her presence and create a visual photographic space in which body, memory, and abstraction coexist. Her work has been exhibited at the Studio Museum of Harlem, ICA Philadelphia, and the Brooklyn Museum, among other institutions, and is represented in permanent collections, including the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C. Her first monograph, Lick of Tongue, Rub a Finger on Soft Wound, published by MAC, was shortlisted for the Paris Photo Aperture Photo Book Award for First Photo Book. And lastly, I'd like to share that Keisha was a 2003 CPW Artist in Residence, and to have her here now on the heels of her recent exhibition, Recess, which concludes her time here at CPW as the 2024 Saltzman Prize winner, has truly been a full circle moment. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Keisha Scarville, and afterwards, she'll be joined by Tina for a conversation. Thank you.
Hello, hello, can you hear me? Thanks. Hi, everybody. Good evening. So before I start, I want to dedicate tonight's talk and conversation to Alma Scarville, Marvin Scarville, Colbert Kennedy, who are no longer here in physical presence, but with me always and in spirit. And I also want to recognize the passing of a dear colleague and inspiration, Nona Faustine, who was an amazing photographer, mother, and just all around individual, and also continues to impact me through her presence in my life. So I'm going to share a lot of words tonight. So, and I'm going to be going in a couple of different directions, but I promise I will land on the show here, and I'm going to try and do this in about 20 minutes. So, yeah. Oh, well, first let me get rid of this. Um, so I do want to say, like, since my first introduction to photography, I've always been captivated by both its inherent stillness and its potential to precipitate a variety of movements, by both its revelatory functions and how aptly it obscures, its fixity alongside its malleability. It is perhaps this paradoxical alignment that has kept me tethered to photography as a practice for so long. I am immensely and endlessly grateful for spaces like CPW, where I did my first artist residency a very long time ago. And all the individuals here who have built and contributed to the scholarship, expression, and community of image makers. And I am especially grateful, and I want to thank Ms. Tina Campt, who I have the utmost respect for. I am so excited for tonight. I just want to say that. And who has never sugarcoated a word to me, but only provides words that allow me to think deeper. So thank you. So the first slide I want to share is this image. And, in thinking about how I wanted to talk about tonight's presentation and thinking about the discussion, but also thinking about the exhibition, I kept coming back to this film by Charles Burnett, To Sleep with Anger, which was made in 1990. And Burnett, who is a prominent filmmaker, best known for his film Killer of Sheep and his affiliation with the Black independent movement and LA Rebellion. The film is a story about the tension between modernity and tradition, specifically folklore, and how this is triggered by migration from the South to California, specifically South Central Los Angeles. But it's roughly about first 5 to 10 minutes of the film that I wanted to focus on. In the opening scene, we are introduced to Gideon, who is one of the main characters. He sits quietly in a room, which is sparsely decorated. We see an image of a woman behind him, and based on the clothing and the style of the image, it is an old photograph, perhaps an ancestor. There is a mimicking between Gideon and this image behind him. They are both dressed formally, wearing hats. Their body language almost mirrors each other. Their facial expressions are equally pensive, stoic, and slightly hint to the observer of the camera. His hand rests on a table covered in white cloth, and on top sits a bowl of fruit. Slightly outside of the bowl is a half-cut apple. It almost reads as an ancestral altar. And we are given this we're given this scene for a while, and then what happens is that the bowl begins to become engulfed in flames, and not only just the bowl, but Gideon's body. And there's this spontaneous ignition that then leads us into the scene, into the movie itself. And there's something about this opening scene that I connect to, and it also connects to a couple of themes which are operating in my work that I want to speak on tonight. Specifically thinking about what is released from within, what is transmitted through migration, and how are we irrevocably transformed by grief, particularly the grief that comes along with loss or migration, and how does that lead us to seeing things differently? The next image that I wanted to share, and these are just some things to kind of springboard into talking about my work. Give me 5 minutes. I'm going to talk about latency. From the very first time I entered the dark room, I was and has been since I was a teenager, just really enthralled with this idea of latency, the idea of the unseen presence of the image prior to its development, and what activates the image to become apparent. What is the gesture required? And the latent image resides in a type of limbo, And what I mean by this is meaning that it's a space of uncertainty until it's activated, until it's fixed, until it's stabilized. And I'm thinking about, when I'm thinking about latency, I'm thinking about outside of the photographic, what other latent states exist within our everyday spheres, and how does it get activated? And the next image I want to share is the picture of my parents. This is an image taken of my parents in 1968. Both of my parents were not born here. Actually, with the exception of one of my cousins, most, if not all of my family resides in Guyana, South America. But during the late 60s, my mom and my dad made the decision to come here. And I often think about this image, and actually my mom is actually pregnant with my older brother in this image. And I'm thinking about this image because throughout the work that I'm doing, whether it's present or not, I'm always thinking about archive and how the archive kind of functions as a signifier for the future. And so thinking about like, what are those latent narratives that are embedded in the archive, and how do they become understood and activated in the future? And just thinking about these gestures that allow for latent images to become present. You know, these gestures don't guarantee immediate legibility. This image and the gesture that was necessary to create this image, you know, uncovers something very different for me, seeing it now in 2025. And so a lot of the early work I was doing was mostly documentary and going back to Guyana and documenting my family there. I was really thinking about and just really interested in the ways in which the individuals within my family inhabited space and how they related to the landscape around them. And so not only in terms of how they inhabited and their relationship to the landscape around them, but also their relationship to each other, you know, how we come together and form and commune together. And so a lot of the work that I was doing was really kind of focusing and documenting those moments. But now, you know, some of the questions that are guiding my process is, how can a photograph be a participant in the conjuring of presence? And what I mean by this kind of thinking about conjuring of presence, like this, the radical act of embodiment, calling forth and activating the latent narratives of land and body. And how does the camera assist us in accessing these intangibilities and breaking temporal formalities, especially in the space of grieving and mourning? And working with the camera as a tool for seeking out the edge of visibility. So I'm gonna talk about two projects and then talk about recess. And the first project, which was referenced in the introduction, Mama's Clothes, which I've also kind of started to change the name to Alma, Mama's Clothes. In 2014, I was actually doing a residency in Syracuse at the time. I was doing a residency at Lightwork. And at that time, I was interviewing my parents. And I knew that it was approaching 50 years of them being here in America. So I was conducting a series of interviews and just kind of asking them, like, how did they relate to the landscape of America? You know, not only personally, but socially, politically. Had anything changed within them? Had their views about America changed? So while I was at my residency in Syracuse, I called my mom. I asked her if she would be open to coming up to Syracuse for me to photograph her. And she agreed. And we were outside photographing. And I remember at the time, I was setting up my camera and just decided to to step into the frame alongside her. And maybe a few seconds, not even minutes after this image was taken, and this was August 13th, 2014, she's like, I just don't feel well. I can't, I just don't want to do this right now. And she went back to the hotel. And I think maybe a day later, she's like, I'm going to go back to New York. I just don't feel good. And she went back to New York, ran some tests, and was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer. And a year to the day when this image was taken, on August 13th, 2015, my mother passed from complications from cancer. And so, I often talk about this, but anyone who has experienced a loss understands like the way in which it impacts you. I remember reading Naomi Klein's Shock Doctrine. I don't know why I was reading it at the time, but I was reading it, and I remember she was describing a shock as losing one's narrative. And that was definitely something that I was thinking about. And so how does the shock of loss disrupt, abolish, and even absent one's narrative? So, I knew I wanted to do something in honor of her. I knew I wanted to think about a way in which the camera could play a role in kind of navigating this space of grief and loss. And so there were a few things that I was, considering and thinking about. And the first place I went to, I started to just kind of do research. And the first place I went to was spirit photography, particularly doing research into spirit photography within the late 1800s, at a time when photography is in its very early stage. Folks don't really understand or have a widespread knowledge of how it works. And we also see, this kind of presence of mediums, late 1800s or 1900s. We see the presence of mediums and seances, and these collective spaces where individuals are coming together in order to connect with those who have passed on to the other side. And so the medium became something that I was really fascinated by, as thinking about like the body as this space of transmission, and the intermediate between these two different spaces, but also the presence of ectoplasm within this conversation. So a lot of the mediums, in order to kind of prove their abilities or talents of contacting those from the other side, would spew this kind of gauzy material from their nose, mouth, ears, as proof. And so there was this really fascinating dichotomy in terms of like the camera's role within these spaces, as kind of like providing evidence, but also the materiality of absence, like the ways in which the gauze was kind of a stand-in to kind of provide proof of that which someone was not able to touch, the intangible. So I was thinking about that, and I was also reflecting on my own culture, my own understanding, and the way in which I was kind of brought up in terms of ancestral veneration, and the figure, particularly within Yoruba, West African culture, of the Egungun. And this is an ancestral spirit, or the ancestors that come back and make themselves present or make themselves known. And when the individual is mounted by the ancestor, they're covered from head to toe in this kind of elaborate fabric. And so when we look at this figure, we're not looking at the individual. We're looking at and communing with the ancestor. So it was these things that were kind of at play that I was kind of really thinking about the aesthetics of spirit photography as a visual strategy. and not necessarily invested in kind of the veracity of spirit photography, but more so its ability to shape image culture and one's desire, and taking the image as an agent to quell one's grief and visualize the invisible. And so from there, I decided that I wanted to kind of engage with the clothing of my mom, her fabrics and her clothing. One of the first images I took was this one, where I thought about my own body as the medium, and her clothes as the ectoplasm. And, there was something about, and it's still kind of, it was like still kind of, operates, of course, in my brain, like the ways in which her smell was still kind of lingering within the fabric. And that the ways in which it kind of held on to these different aspects of her presence. And so a lot of the images I was taking was just me just kind of wanting to kind of be engulfed in that. And then I started to kind of move into like the visual of the egungun, and kind of thinking about the ways in which my body could be covered with her clothes. And so thinking about like the fabric as its own archive, and even thinking about it as a residual transcript. And so it wasn't necessarily about the ways in which the clothing kind of held like some type of functionality. I wanted it to kind of be transformed in that regard. So while doing this project, I traveled back to Guyana. It was my first time traveling back alone, without any of my family members. And so I packed a bag of her clothes and traveled back to Guyana, and photographed in and around the places that she inhabited in Guyana. So these images were taken in and around my grandfather's house. Not this one, but. So also part of this project, and I'm just going to move a little bit faster because I don't want to take up too much time. So also part of this project, I was thinking about like the ways in which textiles kind of created space of its own, the spatial and corporeal reconfigurations of my mother's body. I started to think about the images and the ways in which they could be photographed to kind of hint to her presence within the images. And I started to kind of move away from photographing in color and just became more invested in kind of thinking about the ways the patterns kind of blended into each other. So this piece, so there was a dish that my mom used to make, it's called cowfoot soup. And anytime she made it, she would save the bones and clean them, bleach them, and then paint a message into them and give them to me and my brother. And it was one of my first lessons on how to kind of transform something that could be thought of as refuse into treasure. And over time, it became this kind of exchange between the two of us. I would paint some and give them to her. She would paint some, give them to me. After she passed, I still have a huge bag of bones that were never activated. And so I created a series, especially for her, where the message is actually covered. And these are just some install shots of this exhibition I have up now, that I co-curated at ICP, titled To Conjure, which features work by myself along with Woodling Cadet, Tara Kragnack, Koyo, Shayla Miller, Sasha Wartzel. Oh God, I'm forgetting somebody. Koyo. I just say Koyo. Shayla Miller. I got everybody, I think. I got everybody. Camila Janan Rashid, sorry. So next project that I do want to talk about, and again, I'm just going to move a little bit more quickly. So around the same time I was interviewing my mom, I was also interviewing my dad. This is one of the images that I took back in 2014. During one of the interviews, he mentioned to me that he no longer saw himself as, I asked him if he was going to go back to Guyana, and he said, absolutely not. He's like, he's like, I'm not Guyanese. He's like, I'm American. And so I was kind of flabbergasted actually by that. And so thinking about like, what does it mean to claim the identity of America, or even claim the identity of being American? And so I wanted to do a project that kind of spoke to that transition, and claiming of a country that is not the country of your birth. And so he had gifted me his first passport photo when he was 16 years old. And I made a bunch of copies of it and wanted to kind of activate it in some way. And there's something about the passport photo, like the way in which we're being asked to kind of neutralize ourselves to be photographed. But there's so much that is embedded in that image. And this kind of ties back into some of the things I was talking about in terms of latency that I wanted to kind of unearth in the passport. So I think at the time I made, I have to shout out Tina. I was reading Tina's book while doing this project. You know, one thing that I think about as for passport photos in terms of like, it's an image that is taken with the purpose of future movements. And while thinking about this, I was working on this project. I was also reading Tina's book that kind of inspired me to kind of really think through how I wanted to activate the images. And so I decided to do a series of visual interruptions into the surface of the image. In some cases, scratching away, in some cases using collage to activate latent histories, desires, and conversations that I've had with my father about his process and journey coming here. But also thinking about like not only the histories we carry with us when we move from one place to another, but you know, the social landscape that we become embedded in. Alongside that, you know, I was also thinking about other possibilities of who my father could become. So other imaginings, like I was also thinking about like, what if my father became a superhero or a sea god? And so, you know, I started off this project, but it became part of my daily practice. And currently now at Higher Pictures Gallery, there are about 322 of these passport images that are on display. And so bring me to recess. So thinking about, you know, me personally, like, especially since the passing of my mom, there's been a constant movement between two lands, between Guyana and America. And, you know, for the past few years, I've been thinking a lot about the limbo dance. You know, in the limbo dance, you know, the goal is for the body to move under this stick without touching it. You know, as the stick lowers, success is based on one's ability to gradually contort one's body to clear these kind of impossible spaces. And so Wilson Harris, who is a Guyanese writer, you know, in his essay, History, Fable, and Myth in the Caribbean and Guyanas, he postulates that this movement was first developed during Middle Passage. And then what happens, you know, in Trinidad specifically, we see the limbo dance before it becomes this kind of popular iteration of what it is now, the limbo dance was done at funerals to kind of celebrate the passing of the body from life into death. So for me, the limbo dance became this kind of really interesting metaphor to explore liminality, thresholds. The threshold is this kind of unmappable amalgam of histories. And thinking about, I was thinking about Joy James, who's a writer and scholar, where she wrote in an essay, Proto-Feminists and Liberation Limbos. Limbos are ideal spaces for witnessing and generating movements to address the inadequacies of linear liberation. The past, present, and future coexist and overlap. Time is nonlinear. So I was really thinking a lot about what resides within the recess of vision, and even thinking about Alan Sekula's thinking about shadow archive. And so, and also thinking about how is grief present within these recesses, and even dealing with my own sense of grief, and how does that activate this journey? And Francis Weller's book, he wrote this book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. He wrote, "We are laid low by grief, taken down below the surface of the world, where shadows and strange images appear." And so I was thinking about that in relationship to this show, and wanting to kind of create a space where, all of this, like thinking about what resides within that space, what resides on the edge of sorrow, what resides on the edge of visibility. And I'm just going to share something that I wrote in thinking about recess. In the recess, shadows illuminate. Clocking time doesn't cling to our bodies. We cease to be shaped by light. We unfold. It is an invocation, a stitch, a cloaking. There aren't too many places to hide, even underwater, but there are crevices in which to uncover. It is, sorry. I hold myself, every breath is an echo in my ear. I'll never be found. I close my eyes to listen. The recess is the edge of visibility. My body shakes, detours, flails, is cut and pasted. Startled by salt water, speaking in hydro tongues, jumbled prayers shaped by occluded movements. My eyes readjust. The recess is spray painted black. My grandmother stands in the middle of a stark, singularly lit room. Small specks of light hit the wooden walls, and for a brief moment, I can only think about the history of wood and how beautifully striking it is when seen in the dark. Peaks of the night landscape come through the breaks in the boards. My grandmother waits, solid, self-possessed, sovereign. There was never any other stance for Miss Mullen Agatha Kennedy. The fabric of her dress is a dense magenta blue and white floral print. She asked me to help her finish buttoning her dress. They are small, dainty, burdensome. Tears emerge. It feels as though my whole body is welling up. I cannot hold them back. It is inevitable. I have only one question: when? When can I see my mother again? She quietly smiles and gently shakes her head. Not yet. It is a husky and comforting negation. She then takes her finger and pulls her cheek back to show me her silver tooth. Darkness. The recess is dark, but it is full of visions. Flashes between heat and reprieve are speckled across my back. Collapsing into dimensionless spaces where sacred sounds are only heard by those who've been initiated into the shadow. My mother says she can hear my grandmother calling her while she sleeps. I never tell her that I hear the voice too. Thank you. Am I doing this right?
Good evening, everyone. That's right. You're supposed to say hello. It's a very good call and response. We're going to get started like that. So I have to begin by saying how incredibly grateful I am to be up here with you. I say that because I have been inhabiting your work for almost a year, more or less. I spent the summer at a residency in Banff, and I showed you a photograph of that, where I was writing about the Passport series, and I forced you to send me a PDF of all of them. And I printed out every single one of them, and I put them on this massive wall of my office. And as I was writing, I would walk up to them, and I would have little conversations with them. And then I would go and sit down, and I would write something about them. And so I started having these conversations with your father and his passport photo and the superheroes and the gods that he became and all of those many, many, many different incarnations of him. And then I moved on to Mama's Clothes, and I've been in Mama's Clothes for about 2 months now. And where do I begin? I think I'm going to begin where there's 2 directions I want to go. One of them has to do with grief, because the book that I'm writing right now is really about how Black contemporary artists like you have helped me to understand what it means to grieve and what it means to actually allow yourself to make contact with that grief. And that you do it through, not through words, you do it through contact and what you describe as conjuring, and the ways in which those we have lost can manifest in really profound ways visually. And so I guess I want to start out by asking you about this notion of, that's been incredibly helpful to me, of the materiality of absence. And I know that you framed it in terms of spirit photography and the research that you were doing. But in the photographs of Mama's Clothes, where you talked, I loved hearing you talk about this residue that's in her clothes that she really needed to get sensory contact with. So the smell, right? But the other thing that you're doing, and this goes to a broader question that I have with your work, is that you're deeply invested in the project of activation. So not just making images, but making those images do something, making us understand what they are doing to us, right? So the idea that just looking over and over and over and over and over again at the ways in which you allow your mother's clothes to swaddle you, to swallow you up, to hold you, to make you invisible, right? And it's not simply that you are covered by them. You take on their form, right? Sometimes you're just an outline that we can only see by virtue of the fact that there's a wrinkle in the pattern, right? That's the only way we know you're there. And so you allow, not only you allow contact with those clothes, but you become part of them. And so I wanted to ask you about the process of making those photographs as conjuring, because there are so many dimensions of them that make them almost 3-dimensional. And so there's a line that to me I kept falling into, which is when those patterns come off, in my sense, off the page or off the screen. and allow something to be conjured that is, I guess it's another question for you. That's a different way of putting the same question, which is, what does it mean to be a medium in photography?
Ooh, okay. Well, I think first and foremost, the process of, well, first I want to say that I think that, one of the reasons why I think I'm so drawn into this idea of latency is because I think it kind of holds this understanding that there are images present at all times. You know what I mean? Like there's that we carry even when we're not looking, like there are images that are kind of like in us all the time. And so I think for me, like when I came to that place of kind of understanding that there's something here, but it may not necessarily be visible, I just wanted to figure out, like, what does it mean to tap into that? And what is like for me, like I was always thinking about, or the ways in which I was being taught was like the camera was recording whatever was in front of it. And so now, how do I record something that's something or someone who isn't there? And also there's this aspect of absence that I also think that is something that I think is understood differently in death. One of the things that I kind of came to this place of was with the loss of my mom, and under other individuals since her, is that there is an abundance of stuff in the wake of absence. And so the body may not necessarily be present, but there is so much, and there's so much stuff, but there's also so much that we're holding to. And so for me, I was really thinking and really interested in like, what could photography do? Can photography be the agent that captures absence? I was really interested in that being the question that focused how I responded to the images I was making. And there was something about even wanting to kind of break or push the two-dimensional, like there's the two-dimensional, and even thinking about depth, I was really thinking more so, okay, there came a point where I was just like, okay, there's some type of collapsing that's happening in the image, and what does that mean, or how does that respond or reflect in what's happening in me? So there was things that I was experiencing inside that I wanted to kind of think about in relationship to the camera. So I'm thinking about my body as medium, but I'm also thinking about camera as medium too. So that there's this kind of physical transmission, but I'm also thinking about like, is the camera a medium? Like, can the camera be a medium? So I don't know if I have the answers. They're more so like questions that I think are the things that I'm thinking about when I'm taking pictures.
Those are answers. Those are answers. They're really rich and full. I mean, one of the things that I've been learning from your work is precisely what you just said, is that even in the absence of a person, you're inundated with their presence, right? And then that's something that I think that you're able to capture in really powerful ways, is this lingering presence. And we've talked about this sort of briefly, is that one of the things that I think is going on, or that I'm really fascinated by in your images, is that I think of them as after images. And I don't know, there've got to be a lot of photographers in this room, and so you've got to know what an after image is, but I'll tell you what I mean when I say it. What I mean when I say it is, I mean it optically, that the sort of archetypal instance of an after image is when you look at a bright light and then you look away. And whatever that bright light was, when you close your eyes, it's still there. You can still see that outline, right? And so you're not looking at the light, or you're not looking at some bright image, but you're still seeing it. It's still lingering in your eyes. It's still lingering in your mind. So it is the archetype of an absent presence, right? And to me, that's what grief is. Grief is always about having this person who is no longer there being so present that you cannot avoid them, and you have to constantly. A friend of mine talked about grief is, you just keep running into that person, and suddenly they're there. They're right there, and you're, oh, hi, there you are. But the way in which you conjure your mother, right, is as this after image of her. It is she's there in those textiles, and she's still embracing you. She's still touching you. You're still smelling her. And so to me, that's how you're using this medium, right? Both your body to actually make visible that which you are feeling, and also to capture that moment of presence and give it to us, to gift it to us. And so you were actually responding. We had a brief sort of conversation, pre-conversation, and I was really fascinated by that thing that you said to me, where you said you were thinking about how grief itself could be understood as a threshold.
Yes.
And I want to know more about that.
I think that it's something that, we all pass through. And I'm talking about grief in terms of the loss of my mother. But, I referenced this book by Francis Weller earlier, where in the book, he kind of talks about all these different types of grief. Like there's the grief of losing someone that you love, but also the grief of those parts of you that may not necessarily be touched or understood, or the ways in which we experience the grief of the world. And so that these are things that we have to kind of engage, we have to kind of bring our attention to, and allow ourselves to kind of experience it. And to not allow for it to kind of like fall into, these like the reserves. So I think about, like it was definitely a passage for me, having to be by someone. I hope I'm not dragging anybody down, but to be by someone's side as they are kind of moving through probably like the most difficult thing, where your body is no longer in control, and it breaks down, and you don't have, there's a tremendous amount of vulnerability. And so not only having to witness that, but also, being present at every step of the way. I think that in itself is a process that took me from whoever I was before to whoever I am now, as a photographer, as a person. So I think that it is a threshold, in that it is this kind of, when it's someone that is, and it's not just, I'm talking about it specifically about my mom, but I don't know if it's exclusive to a loved one, when you witness and hold and experience and feel suffering in that way, it is something that you ride through, and that changes you, and you're just different. You know what I mean? And you carry it all the time.
I mean, this idea of threshold, this takes me to recess in some ways, in a lot of ways. And I have to say that I do find that I would describe you as one of the most exquisite photographers of shadow and darkness. Truly exquisite.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And so I part of me goes back to this collaborative project that we worked on about a year ago, which was that we co-curated what do they call it? Was it a screening room or a guest room? A guest room for the photography, an online photography journal called Dederick, which is based in Switzerland. And we developed this call. We had to come up with a theme. And I learned a lot about you in that theme. But the theme was the poetics of darkness. And part of me wants to read that, the call. I do have it. I'm infinitely prepared. I want to read that because it says a lot about what you're interested in relationship to darkness, and it helped me to understand your work in a different way. Where is it? Here it is. Oh, here it is. There we go. As both a technological medium and a rich modality of cultural expression, photography is both taught and theorized as a manipulation of light, where the central question is always how do photographers respond to and position themselves, their cameras, and subjects in relation to light. In this way, photography is most often a practice that implicitly seeks to move away from darkness. But what would it mean to embrace a counterintuitive understanding of photography that inverts this structuring logic? Put differently, rather than focusing on how light interacts with the subject, what would it look like to focus on how photographic subjects interact with and respond to darkness and shadow? What might it look like to engage darkness as itself an active site of illumination? And what would it mean to activate shadow in ways that make darkness resonate? And I think that Recess is a masterclass in that, about what does it mean to activate shadow in ways that make darkness resonate. And that's something that you kept saying over and over again when we were looking at the photographs that were submitted is, I'm looking, is it active? Right. Is darkness activated? Right. And as somebody who I see as an exquisite photographer of shadow and darkness, I want to know how you do that. Okay. I want you to talk about formally, like, what does it mean to do exactly what we were asking these photographers to explore?
I mean, I've been photographing a long time, but I think I always like to think that photographers have a special sensitivity to light. I think I'd like to think that photographers tend to see light or understand what light is doing at all times. I remember at a certain point, like I became kind of like a human light meter. A friend of mine would ask me, what would be the aperture shutter speed? And I would just know it, and she would do it. She's like, and she was like, how the hell did you do that? It became just so innate. But I think, definitely, I think in the wake of like working on the project about my mom, I started to want to photograph in situations where it wasn't always about what the light was doing, but what the shadows were doing. And just really wanting to kind of find those spaces of thinking about what kind of resides within those dark spaces. I mean, admittedly, Roy de Carava is a huge influence on me in that regard, where I'm always or endlessly fascinated by what is happening. Those images, all of his images for me are so much about what's happening in the darkness. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about that and what that looks like for the images that I'm making. And so it's necessary for me, it was necessary to kind of think about like, how do the shadows come alive? Like, and what is the work that is required to kind of see through darkness? Mm-hmm. That's something that I'm thinking about in those images. And even in some cases, there is this kind of ways in which darkness kind of embraces illegibility that I also was really interested in, or I was thinking about as an active participant, and think something that I wanted to kind of bring to the images that I was making. So it was kind of twofold, like in terms of how I create images. I mean, it's more so that that's the thinking than the actual like technical components. But and I'm always teaching this to my students when I was teaching more technical classes, was always talking about tending to the shadow, and how they, not only how they photograph, but how they think about the final product of their images,
I mean, it also reminds me of the idea that I think you touched on at the beginning of your talk, which is what does it mean to think of opacity as both something that gives you access, right, to something that isn't self-evident, because there's a way in which so your use of textiles to me is also really provocative, because what we're having to do is we're having to actually look through, right? So what does it mean not simply to look at,
Right.
but to look through,
Right.
and to access part of, right, part of the visual range, and not all of it. And even within many of your photographs where you have veils, right? So you're challenging us to be both curious and at the same time to deal with the limitations of what we can
Right.
or should see. Right.
Yes.
And it's a very challenging dynamic, because I think there's something about the nature of photography that we think it's supposed to be a revelation always.
Absolutely.
Right. It's always supposed to be what we get, as opposed to thinking about what the limits are. And I think the other thing that you're bringing out that your work does is it challenges us to think about intimacy, right? To what extent are we supposed to, have full access, even to grief, right? I'm looking at the time. I want you to see if you want to answer that, because
I personally strongly kind of push against this idea of the image kind of being its own confession. I don't necessarily subscribe to that thinking in terms of the images that I take. I am really the image for me, I think, is about, how does the image kind of question how we see, and, what is the labor of looking, and how is that labor of looking, being given, what does it mean to kind of sit and really sit with an image? And there's a slowness in there that, I don't know if becomes a luxury, I think now, in terms of slowing down and having to kind of move through and think about ways in which the image itself needs to be navigated, and that you don't necessarily end up with a full understanding, that there is more, there's something, there's elements of it that you have to kind of wrestle with, maybe.
Right. I'm just aware that we've gone on for an hour and you wanted to have some conversation with the audience.
Okay.
So I'm going to try and open up now. We've got about 20 minutes where we can have some conversation, and you get to ask some questions as well. So any questions? Do we need to pass these around? No. People can just yell. To be aware that this is being live streamed, so that folks would, okay, they can hear. They can hear you as long as you project.
But speak up just so that you can hear them.
Okay. Go ahead.
I was very moved by the talk. It was by the conversation, and also yours speaking about your own work. Many things moved me. One of the things that I think I didn't truly realize is the idea of self-portrait. And would you, I have a couple of points and questions. Would you consider this body of work self-portraits? And then I was also really moved by your, how to put it, your interaction with fabric and how it means, what it means to you, and how it becomes transformative, and how it transformed you. And the idea, if those are self-portraits, that when you put the fabric on you, it's like you became sculpture, you became a different entity. So all that I found quite profound, and I'd be curious to hear what you have to say.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. I think two questions I think I often get asked is like, do I consider them self-portraits, and are these performances? Those are the two questions I think I get a lot. And the reason why I'm saying that now is because I think it's something that I definitely think about a lot. I personally don't think of them as self-portraits. And maybe that is because of how I have come to define it. That though my body is in it, I don't necessarily see it as me kind of speaking about myself, but thinking about how the body, particularly my body, can be that space of conjuring my mom. So I'm thinking of them more as like portraits of her than self-portraits. And even to take it like even in a different direction, like sometimes I even think about them as collaborations. And I think there is something in that space that can start to kind of engage of the possibility of them being self-portraits. So those are the things that I think about along with when I think about whether they're self-portraits or not. I think it's a question I think I often kind of go back and forth about. And for me, I think that there was something about operating in the way in which I was working with her fabrics and the textiles that offered this way of thinking about body becoming sculptural, or even kind of being transformed and being read as something else. That I also was thinking about the textile as kind of blurring or even kind of creating its own spatiality. That, was something I was really drawn to in terms of making the images. So there were these new kind of ways in which to kind of think about space and think about the body in a way that I hadn't thought about it in any way before, that offered something different than how I'd seen textile or portraiture be used before. Hello. Hi.
I'm thinking about what you said about the labor of looking at images, and I'm wondering if you could speak to how you engage or even control the level of labor that the viewer has to engage in when looking at your photos. And I think that there's something, at least what I thought about, in the way that pattern and like darkness interact, and how maybe that might be a way that you engage in that. If there are any others.
I mean, I think initially it was more so really wanting to play with the patterns or work with the patterns, like how the patterns were affecting each other. I also was thinking a lot about op art as well, as like that, the way in which that kind of engages the looking, and how that even kind of sometimes even may be frustrating for a viewer as well. So that was something that I was thinking about initially in terms of how to engage the labor of looking. I think now what I've been doing lately is taking the textile out of the images, or kind of taking that element and now making it like three-dimensional. Like in order for you to get to the image, you have to see through something or move around something. And, what does it mean to kind of have these different sight lines, and how does the image change depending on where you are? So I'm now thinking about like how we have to kind of move around to see the image as well. There's a hand back here. Yeah, go ahead. I see that hand. Hey, Kiana, what's up?
realize in that way. Do you ever share some of the messages that she wrote, or is that?
No. No offense. My mommy loved me. Let's just say that.
There was a question back here, and I also see your hand too.
I wanted to know, like, what inspired chicken foot picture?
Oh,
Because your class is so great.
I did.
I'm actually making some soup.
Okay. So there was actually a series of images that were of food. I didn't talk about it in the presentation, but one of my there was a portion of the project where I was photographing my mother's favorite foods, and so she loved chicken foot soup. I could not stand it, but she loved it. It just freaked me out. But so I remember, so I wanted to create an image where there was some tenderness. So that was the thought behind the chicken foot. And then there was, I think I showed an image of a plantain. There was the images that I took of that, like I actually didn't photograph them like right away. In some cases, I just kind of allowed it to kind of sit for a while. And I was thinking about how time impacts the organic. And so instead of just like bringing it home and like photographing it, I would just wait and just see how things started to kind of transform depending on how long it had been. And then that's when I would, like, if it started to change or shift, that's when I chose to take the picture.
Do you find that after working on a project that
Could you speak up just a little bit more?
after working on a project that embraces the spirit realm so much that it continues to come through work that you do now? And also, was that happening before you worked on a project like this?
So the project about my mom, I think, completely shifted and changed my relationship to photography and how I approach creating images. I'm trying to remember your question. Oh.
That's something that was clear that comes
The
out.
one with you and your mother when you were in the grass, I
Mhm.
almost felt like I could see an aura around you, around you. And that was before you even started to like discuss the spirituality aspect.
So I think that there's aspects, well, first let me say that I think that there's aspects of that project that I think that kind of spills into everything that I do now. And I do want to credit that to that process, but also kind of thinking about my mom still being with me. I was reading this book by Dan Fox. It's called Limbo. And there's a section of the book, but I want to say he was probably referencing someone else, but there was a section of the book where he talks about, the ways in which things kind of refuse to, like when something kind of refuses to recede, like that's the definition of haunting. That which does not necessarily move into the past. And so I don't necessarily think of myself as being haunted by my mother, but most so kind of just alongside, in a different way.
There's a question. You had your hand up. There was some. Yes. And then
Intriguing your comment about latency.
Mhm.
Old school too, like the dark room and all that. I feel bad for young photographers that will never know that experience of processing their own film and seeing that first print come up. I mean, it's like magic. Right? You never forget the first time you print the first print. I'm just curious now, do you still shoot film, or do you shoot digital, or?
I shoot digital. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. No, I mean, I like to think that magic still happens. I do, but just in different ways. I do, and this is nothing. This is not to negate my experience with the darkroom, but I do wonder more. Maybe it's just maybe a wonder. I do wonder about is there a magic to digital? Can there be a magic to digital? I like to say yes. Not in the same way, but I do wonder if there's a technical.
I still feel like I'm teaching digital for a while, right? I processed all my own film printed for over 30 years.
Yeah.
And I think I still, when I'm in the Lightroom, I'm still in the darkroom.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Like
Yeah,
when I'm looking at what I'm going to do, I'm still learning and dodging. My mental, I feel like I wouldn't be the photographer I am now without all that darkroom experience.
And at the same time, one of the things I was just thinking as you were both talking is that there are different forms of magic, and that the darkroom magic is alchemy, right? That's a very specific kind of magic, but it's not the only kind, right? And that I think that light itself is a form of magic, and we get access to light through different media. So I go along with you, is that I think that alchemy teaches us stuff. It teaches us to mix, right? It teaches us certain kinds of balance that helps you to appreciate the magic in other realms. Right. And sometimes you wait too long.
I'm intrigued by the material, the fabric itself that's in your images, which is very graphic. But you've removed the color because the prints are in black and white. So the graphic becomes more important than the color. So I'm intrigued by what the history of the pieces, the actual pieces of fabric that are in your images, and how that history relates to you emotionally as you're living through this experience of creating an image.
So the textiles are, I would say 90% of them are my mother's. She loved clothes, she loved fabric, she loved patterns, she loved color. And she loved shopping. So there was that was something that I was actually having a conversation with, where someone was like, maybe doing history, researching the history of the particular garments or the fabrics, which is something that I have been thinking about. I think right now it was more so just kind of that these belong to touch the skin of, covered the body of, and now, wanting it to cover my body or kind of be present within the image. So that's the emotional aspect of it. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I found it interesting how you dealt with the memory of your mother. I felt there was, deep connection. There was this intimacy, there was physical connection, and you kind of sometimes substituted yourself. It seems like, or your body, for her, and so there was. And then I look at the images with regard to your father. It seems like it took, 50 when he was 15 as a passport, and you created imagery. And so I was wondering, what was the emotional and the what were you thinking and what was going on when you were? I mean, to me, it looked like it was either with these images of how you thought your father could have been, or how you imagined or wanted him to be, or what was that connection with how were the
For the passport images, I mean, I would say all of the above. I think like the way in which the project operates now, you know, I'll have conversations with my dad, or, you know, based on conversations I've had with him, you know, I would create images that some of the images kind of speak to stories that he shared with me about his experience. There was one where like there was like a puzzle piece over his face. And that was part of, you know, I asked him why America, like, you know, Guyana, you know, during the late 1960s, and this is kind of post-independence, there was like this mass exodus. And so folks were going to the US, they were going to England, or they were going to Canada. And so I asked my dad, this was just like, you know, part of a conversation. I'm like, why America? And without hesitation, he said, the movies. And, you know, there was something, you know, like, you know, the American movies are doing what it's doing, that he was so enthralled with American movies. And that was part of his decision to come here. So while looking for source materials to work with my, the passports, I found this like puzzle piece, this puzzle of all of Sidney Poitier's most iconic roles. And Sidney Poitier, who, you know, is from the Caribbean, he was like, for my dad's generation, he was hero. You know, as I was going through the different pieces, like I found a piece of his face and covered it, you know, with my dad, and just to kind of even see like what that would look like. And so it's like, so there's those gestures alongside, you know, my thinking and imagining of him. So it's a combination of like his narrative, his history, his experience, but also I think that passports, and also I think there's this kind of conversation with immigration that kind of speaks to these possibilities of who one can become, you know, in other places and across borders. And, or even thinking about like the, you know, the ways in which that movement transforms you. You know, even thinking about the idea, you know, the question of becoming an American, you know, what is the shape shifting? What is the transformation that is necessary in order for that to become true? Yeah. And is it possible?
Okay, one more question.
Thank you both for illuminating this spectacular installation here. But I think one of the extraordinary aspects of what's happening now is you have two other major exhibitions at the same time, literally at the same time, at the International Center of Photography and at Higher Pictures Gallery. And on the surface, they seem to be three very different approaches to the image. The one at ICD focusing on the archive in a very unusual way, and the one that Archer alluded to, the passports, is an obsessive project of reiterating your father's passport photograph. I think it numbers over 300 variations now. So how do you see these three installations, these three exhibitions, as relating to one another as different aspects of your approaches to photography?
I mean, I think, I'm gonna say it again, latency. I do think that there is, I think all three connect to that particular thing. You know, like thinking about like what is latent within the archive. And even thinking of these kind of expansive activations or these expansive gestures. The show at ICP is really thinking about how artists that are you know, engaging photography in their practice, how they are thinking outside of institutional archives to create work. So in my case, thinking about like fabric, thinking about my mother's clothes as archive, and other, you know, and there's other things happening within the show. So for all of the artists, I think they're trying to kind of bring or conjure something through the archive that may not necessarily have been seen before, or seen in a particular way, or they're kind of actively trying to create something to bring it into fruition or visualization. I think the show at Higher Pictures is an engagement with archive, but it is an engagement with, like, what are all of these things that are latent within the passport image, and how does that make itself known? And I think that the show here, with Recess, like, looking at what is, what is that kind of space of darkness, and what is kind of being visualized in those spaces. So, and I think all of it is like thinking about, like, the translation of photography, the language of photography as a translator. So those are the things I'm thinking about.
I think I would also add that one of the things that I appreciate most about the bodies of work that are being shown in each of those is that you also are helping us to see photography as ritual practice. That as a ritual practice, right? The ritual practice of encountering your mother's clothes, the ritual practice of, manipulating and reconfiguring your father's image, the ritual practice of actively engaging shadow and darkness. So to me, that's also the revelation of seeing all these bodies of work simultaneously, is watching you activate a series of different ritual practices. And I guess I want to wrap up by just thanking you for that, because you're giving us, it's wonderful to be able to see so much of your work in different contexts. And thank you for sharing all the insights and the backstories as well. So on behalf of the entire audience, I'm going to thank you.
Thank you, Tina. Tina.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I have to run.
Okay.